right, so I'm going to go through the 2.7 homework exercises. The first one is 2.7.7 pretty printing operations. So let's go ahead and open that and go over the assignment details. So this is actually a revisitation of the calculator that we implemented in the previous lesson. As a recap, the calculator class um, basically had like these methods to multiply, add, divide, and subtract. This time, this class has been implemented a little differently in this lesson. Now the methods are not going to be void, they're actually going to return a result. And we're going to have to check out the class to kind of understand what's happening there. So let's look at that first before we look at what we have to do. So let's see. So we've got sum, which is addition, and it looks like it takes two doubles and it will return a double value. And then it looks like the rest of these are pretty much all the same. They take two doubles and return a double. So we know that it's always going to be returning. It's not going to be printing anything. So if it's returning something, we'll either need to print it, or sorry, we'll either need to save it as a double into a double variable, print it to screen, or we can do both. We can save and then print the value of that variable later. All right, so what do we actually have to do with all this? We want to modify the main method, so meaning in the tester class, such that we ask the user for two doubles. That means we're going to have to use a scanner object. And then we're going to store those two doubles so that we could then print the sum, difference, product, and quotient. All right, so let's start off with the first step. First step is to create a scanner object so that we can actually ask for user input. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Oops, scanner, not scammer. So let's go ahead and call it input like we usually do, and then call the constructor, which takes the parameter system.in. Okay, so now we can go ahead and prompt the user for, and let's see, does it want us to, okay, so just enter 2. Okay, prompt the user for two doubles. All right, so we'll have a print statement for that. Okay, we'll just say enter two doubles. And now we actually want to save those two values. So remember, the user can go ahead and put in two numbers after the prompt, separated by spaces. And that just means that we'll have to call next double twice in order to get the two numbers. So we're going to want to store those. And since they're double values, we'll want to store them in a double variable. So I'll just call my first variable n1 for number 1. And we are going to get the first value out of the user input by saying input dot next double. Okay, so what this does is it stores the first value input from user input as a double. Okay, and then we're going to do the same thing, but just with a different variable name. So we want to then store the second value from user input as a double as well. So basically we could just copy this line and then change the variable name. So since we're calling next double again on input, it's going to grab that second value that the user input on the same line. Okay, so now we have those two values. The next thing we want to do is we want to be able to get the sum, difference, product, and quotient. Now remember, these methods, sum, divide, subtract, and multiply, they do not actually have print statements in them. They have return statements, so they're going to be returning values. So there's actually two ways to solve this. We can simply just print out the value by doing the following. So option 1, don't store the results, just print them. So let's see what we can do. We're going to have a print statement. And then inside of that print statement, what we could do is have a method call. Okay, so let's see here. We've got to create a calculator object so we can actually call these methods first of all. So let's actually add that first. Create a calculator object. And remember, we don't have to pass any values to the calculator class to create an object. It just uses a default constructor. So we're just going to say calculator, and then we can call it calc or anything you want, and then call the default constructor, which is just the name of the class. The method has the same name as the class, and then there's nothing passed in here. So just new calculator. So now we can actually let's try calling the sum method. So the sum method belongs to the calculator class, so we're going to have to call it on our on our object called calc. So if we say calc dot sum, which is from here, right here, so sum, it takes two doubles. So we can pass in n1 and n2. And what this will do is, since this method call returns a value, that value is returned now to this print statement. So we're not storing the value that we get back, but we are printing it. And that's actually okay for this assignment because it just says to print it. So let's go ahead and test that out. So let's go ahead and put 1.5 and 2.6. All right, so we see that we do get the value printed out, and that's because we're calling the method here, and the value that that method returns gets returned to this print statement. Now here's a second way that we can do it. We could, for option 2, store the result of the sum method and print out the value. So this actually has two steps. So the first step would be to declare a double variable, and it could be called, I don't know, like sum result, I guess. And we're actually going to do the same exact method call. Okay, so now we're just storing the value into sum result, and now we could actually print out that value. So sum result, now it gets put into the print statement. And you'll see that the result is the exact same thing, except what is not visible to us, the fact that this number is being stored in memory instead of just printed to the terminal. So if I run this, I should get the same result for both of them. Okay, I get 4.1 and 4.1. So it's totally up to you what you want to do. I think that the second method probably is easier for you to comprehend as a new programmer because you're breaking things up into two steps. But if I were just to pay attention to the requirements, which says simply print it out, you don't have to store it anywhere, I would think that this would probably be a better solution. But really, both of them are correct. So I'm just going to go ahead and solve the rest with option 1. So that means that I simply need to also call the other methods. Was it multiply, divide, and subtract, and put those all in print statements as well. So I'm going to change this comment to print out the sum of n1 and n2. And then the next step would be, I'm not sure if they're looking for this in a particular order. Let's see. Let's see here. So it looks like they probably do expect it. I think they also want us to print the actual statement. Yes, it says you should use a single print statement for each equation and use string concatenation to form the equations. Okay, so we could do that as well. So let's work on that. I think actually, so this is going to be kind of a long print statement. So to print out, let's start a new print statement and then we'll consolidate. So I want to print out the sentence, kind of like n1 plus n2 is, and then the result, right? Where these are the correct values that gets put in by the user input. So since those are stored by those variables, we can go ahead and say, I want to print out this number and I want to concatenate. So I want to concatenate a plus sign. I think they wanted spaces around it as well. And then I want to concatenate that second value that I stored as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and just test that portion out to see what that looks like. So I'm going to put in my doubles. So now we can see kind of the beginning of our mathematical statement being printed out as kind of like a sentence. Now we just need to also concatenate an equal symbol and then the result that we're calculating. So let's go ahead and do that. So now I just want to use my concatenation symbol again. And I want to go ahead and put an equals sign with spaces on either side. And then finally, I want my result. So like I said, I could store this into a variable, and in fact, with something longer like this, maybe you want to do that. But you can simply just put this method call in here, and it will return that result value. So now I can actually get rid of this line. And we'll go ahead and test that out before we do the rest. Okay, put in my values. And now we have the result as a complete equation here. And now we can go ahead and do something similar for subtraction. So let's go ahead and add our comments here so we know what we're doing. So I want to next print out the difference of n1 and n2. So that's going to look like n1 minus n2 equals whatever the result is. So I can actually copy this line and modify it a bit to get what I want. So instead of a plus symbol, I want to print out a subtraction symbol as my string literal here. And instead of calling sum, I want to call, I think it's called subtract if we look back at this method. Yes, subtract. So we want to call that. And once again, we are passing in those two values, those two double values, n1 and n2, to get the result back. And then let's actually finish up the rest, and then we can test that we're getting the correct results. So the next thing we want to do is we want to print out, let's see, I think it was the multiplication next. Yes, we want to do the multiplication next. Okay, so we want to print out n1 times multiplied by n2, so it's going to look something like this. And we can again just copy this statement and modify it a bit to fit our needs. So now we're going to print out n1 plus, and then we want to print out the multiplication symbol in our sentence, and then plus n2, or rather concatenating into, and then concatenating the equal symbol. And then this time, since we're multiplying, we want to call the multiplication or the multiply method that is defined in our calculator class. And finally, we're going to do division. So I want to print out n1 divided by n2. So it's going to look something like this with the division symbol in there. So we can go ahead and put that division symbol in that string literal. And this time we are going to call divide. Now we're ready to go ahead and test this out. So let's first run it and put in our values. Okay, so remember, because of floating point error, we will kind of get these longer answers that might not be exactly correct because of the floating point error, but this seems to be doing what we want it to. So now we can go ahead and click check code, and it will check a variety of different values against the expected solution, and it should pass everything. Okay, so if you're having a harder time kind of parsing what all of this is, I would recommend kind of saving the result of these method calls to variables and then putting the variable names here. But in this case, it's not necessary since we just want to print out the result, and we don't necessarily need to waste memory by storing the result somewhere. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next one, 2.7.8. So this one is called full name. So for this exercise, we're going to write code in the form fill class instead of the main method. The code is the same as if you were writing in the main method, but now you will be helping to write the class. It has a few instance variables that stores personal information that you often need to fill in various forms, such as online shopping forms. Read the method comments for more information. As you implement these methods, notice that you have to store the result of concatenating multiple strings or strings in other primitive types. Okay, so the note here with strings and other primitive types is we may need to use parentheses to group primitive types if we want to add things together. So the concatenation produces a new string. Remember, because strings are immutable. So it does not change any of the strings being concatenated. Pay close attention to where spaces should go in the string as well. All right, so it looks like we already have a form fill tester class that's already been filled out with test code for us. We can change the parameters to print our own information, but it's not necessary. It looks like the bulk of our work is going to be in the form fill class. Also, don't put your real credit card information in your program. Okay, so if we do not alter the tester class, this is the information that we're going to expect to get back. All right, so let's take a look at form fill. So as you can see, there are 5 private instance variables. All of them are strings except for the straight number, which is stored as an integer. Notice that the apartment number is actually stored as a string. All right, so we also have some starter code for us. We have this constructor here, but it has not actually been implemented yet. There's no code inside. So it looks like the first thing we have to do is actually put this together. Notice that it is a 2-argument constructor. So we're going to go ahead and use these values to set their corresponding private instance variables. But the other things are going to default to some default values here. So street number should default to 0, and the other remaining strings that are not first name and last name should default to an empty string. So let's go ahead and start with the ones that are being passed in, first name and last name. So first name should get passed to the private instance variable f name. So let's go ahead and say f name is going to get the value of first name. And then last name should correspond to L name. So we'll say L name gets the value of last name. Now the rest, we've got street number, should just be 0. And actually, we don't actually technically have to type this because the default value of an integer value is 0. But we do have to go ahead and initialize the string variables here. Otherwise, they're going to be null. So we want to initialize these two, these remaining strings here as an empty string. So to do that, oh, sorry, that's supposed to be street number. Oh yeah, I typed it. Okay, so street name is going to be the empty string. So empty string is just quotes with nothing in it, not even a space. And then apartment number should also be the empty string. So we'll go ahead and do that as well. All right, so our constructor is done. The next thing is a void method, so a method that does not return anything, but it looks like it changes the values of certain things. So this is technically a setter, and it changes three different private instance variables at once. It expects us to pass in a new street number, a new street name, and a new apartment number. So we want to go ahead and take the values that are being passed in and use those to pass on over to the private instance variables that they correspond to. So we want to change those. So let's see, we've got number is going to set street number. So let's go ahead and take that. And we're going to say street number is going to get number. Street name is going to get street. And apartment number is going to get just apartment. Okay. And we don't want to alter or change the other private instance variables. They should just stay the same as they have been. All right, finally, we have this other method that returns a string, and that string should be a formatted version of the person's name, and that format should follow last name, comma, space, first name. All right, so we know that we're storing the first name as F name and the last name as L name, so I want to return L name, and then plus, or I'm going to concatenate a comma and a space after the last name. So comma, space, and then I want to go ahead and concatenate the first name, which is being stored here in this private instance variable, F name. Okay, and you could actually store this result into a variable and then return that variable. Either way works. Okay, next method is another method that returns a string, but this time it returns the street address that is formatted like this. So notice that this string actually has 2 lines, and since we can only have one return statement, that means that we're going to have to use the new line special character in order to create this new line after street name. So let's see how we're going to do this. We're going to say return, and then we want to get the street number. So it's going to be street number. And then, so that's an integer, but that's okay because everything else that comes after it is a string. So we don't have to worry about integer addition when we don't intend that to happen. So we want the street number, and then we also want a space in between, right? So we actually have to put a string literal here, which is just a space. And then we want the street name, which is this variable here. All right, now at this point, this is where we want our new line. So we're going to go ahead and concatenate that in there. So all we have to do is, with no spaces inside the quotations, we just put that special escape character, which is the /n. Now we want the next two things, which is the apartment, which is, just the string apartment and then the apartment number. So let's go ahead and put that in. So we're just going to put in, we can actually put it right in the string here. So this will be the new string followed by apartment on that new line. So and then we actually want a space after that as well, so that we could now put the apartment number after it. And the apartment number is this variable right here. And that should return our apartment number. Cool. So altogether, that should match the format that you see here. And then I think this is the last method we have to implement. So in this one, we are returning a string that is the credit card information. So we want to return a string with credit card information that is formatted like this. Now notice that we don't actually store this information in this class anywhere. So we're actually going to need those values passed in when we call this method as well. All right, so how do we return this format? So first, we just want this string right here that says credit card number. So the string literal, in other words. So we're going to say credit card, I wanted to copy that, credit card number, colon, space, and then we want the card number, which is represented here as credit card number. So I'm going to go ahead and put that after that quotation mark, and we're now concatenating that integer value there, okay? Next thing should be a new line, right? Because we're looking at this as our example. Should be a new line, and then also the word expires with a colon and a space. So let's concatenate our new line, and then after that new line, we're going to have expires, colon, space. The next thing, now this is a little tricky. So notice that the expiration month and the expiration year are integers. So we don't just want to say expiration month, expiration year, because that's going to divide those numbers. What we want to do is we want to print out the value of the expiration month, and then we want to concatenate this slash symbol as a string. And let's see, are there any spaces separating? No. So I'm not going to put any spaces on either side of that symbol. And then finally, I need this plus symbol to let it know that I want to now concatenate the expiration year. And then finally, I need a semicolon if there's not one there already. Okay. So that should match this format here. So if I go back now to my tester class, you'll see that we are testing each of these methods here. So we're creating the form fill class here, we're setting the address, and then we're printing out the full name, which will be last name, comma, first name, and then the street address, which was that 2-line format that we saw, and then we're printing out the credit card information, which is also on 2 lines. So let's go ahead and check our code. All right, so it looks pretty good. The name is in the correct format, the address is, and then the credit card number information is as well. So let's go ahead and check the code to make sure that we met all of the requirements. And it looks good. All right, so let's go on to the next one. All right, so this one is quote machine. And in a quote machine, we want to write a program that asks the user for a quote and the author of that quote. So again, we're going to be using the scanner class for user input. Now, what we need to do is print the quote in quotation marks, followed by the author's name on the next line. And so we're going to need to use the special character to create a new line rather than using separate print statements. All right, and then it says if you want to, get some other quotes, you can take it from here, but that's where they got their test quotes from. All right, so we want to go ahead and ask for a quote. So we're going to prompt for that. And let's see if there's a particular prompt that they had in mind. Let's just enter a quote. And then we want to go ahead and use this scanner object that they have already created for us. And we want to get the next line that the user inputted. So we're going to go ahead and say that we want to store the user input as a string. So we can call that quote. And then we're going to say input dot next line to get the whole string. Oops, next line. All right. And the next thing we want to do is we want to ask for the author. So let's go ahead and, I need a semicolon there. Let's copy our prompt here, and now we're going to say, I think it's just enter the author of the quote. So let's go ahead and put that for our second prompt. And again, we want to use input.nextLine in order to get the string, but this time we want to store it to a string called author. All right, so now we have all the data that we need. Now we just need to create a new string from the string information that we have inside of quote. This new string should have quotes should have the full quote in quotation marks, and we need to actually escape the quotation marks, otherwise it's going to think we're trying to use the quotes for a string object. So let me show you what that means. So we're going to create a new string, and we can just call it, let's just call it quote 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a quotation mark inside of these quotation marks. But see how my editor is kind of like treating this as like a mismatch? It thinks that this is like an empty string, and then now this symbol is just kind of hanging out, and the editor doesn't know what the heck is going on here. What I will need to do in order to tell the computer that I want to treat this as an actual quote symbol is to put the backslash here, and then that'll actually treat this as the character, not as a symbol demarking a string object. All right, so I've got the first quotation mark here. Now I just need to concatenate the contents of quote and then a closing quotation mark. So I'm just going to put plus, and then the same thing I had on the left there. All right, so I've got that. And now I want to print the quote and then the author on the next line. But they don't want you to use 2 print statements. They want you to use 1. So that's where we're going to have to use the new line character. So this one right here. So just like how I escaped the quotation mark, we're going to use /n for that special character, the new line character. All right, so let's go ahead and say system.out.println. So I'm going to print out the quote. So the quote that has the quotation marks around it, so that's this variable here, quote 2. And then we want a new line. And after that, we want the author's name. So that's just going to be stored inside of the author variable. Alright, so if we did everything correctly, this should work. Let's go ahead and run the code and put in some test stuff. Let's actually use their test. So let's go ahead and say, oh, the places you'll go. And then Dr. Seuss. Alright, so it looks good. Let's go ahead and check the code. Looks great. All of the test stuff prints out correctly. And so this was an exercise kind of reviewing those escape characters.